May the king live forever. Your Majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your Majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you've set up. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I've set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your Majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't the 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your Majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire.
Well, we've been thinking about having another in the fire, and there's the passage right there that has that reference to another in the fire, that 3 men, probably teenagers actually, 3 very young men were bound against their will and the fury of King Nebuchadnezzar and the fury of the flames surrounded them. And everyone saw, yes, 3 men were thrown in, and yet what did the king see? He saw 4. There was a 4th figure there. There was someone else there, another presence that wasn't thrown into the fire, and yet was there with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the way that King Nebuchadnezzar describes it is one like a god, someone who looked like a god. There's this, I guess, this uncertainty and it's a bit of a shadowy kind of what actually happened there. We don't really know. He couldn't quite tell what was going on, but he knew for sure there was someone else in that fire. In many ways, we might feel like Babylon and King Nebuchadnezzar is a long way away. This is another time, another place, a whole nother world, quite a violent and oppressive world, a dictator who can just say what goes and everyone must obey, and lives and limbs are on the line. This might feel like a very different age and a different world. And there are some differences. And yet, there are some similarities for us too. There is a sense of we will all face a little bit of Babylon ourselves. There will be a sense of there are global coercive forces. So King Nebuchadnezzar, when he says that everyone must bow down to this statue, we read earlier in the chapter that every nation, every person was forced to bow down. The entire known world was under the king's control. And when he said bow down, everyone did. There was a global coercive force going on. So what kind of global coercive forces might we be facing right now? As 21st century Westerners here in Melbourne, Australia, we don't really have anyone telling us, you must bow down. And yet, how much of our lives are like this? Staring at a screen. I think today's Babylon probably looks like the fantasy world that we are drawn into living. There are huge demands on you, coercive forces, to draw you into living, whether you call it an Instagram life, a Facebook life, an email life, an online life, a Babylon life, that is not how God has made you to be. And you can get so drawn into this fantasy life, living a life of created by some influencer or created by some algorithm or created by something to go, well, here's the perfect life for you to live, and get drawn into it over and over again so that your whole life kind of gets swept up in this. And at the end of the day, when you look back on your life and what your bank account says about you and what your calendar says about you and how you've spent your hours on this earth, it might look like you are worshipping what or who? Because it's not a question of if you worship. It's a question of what you worship. We all worship. It doesn't matter how secular you think you are. It doesn't matter how modern and progressive you think you are. Everyone worships. It's just a question of what. The word liturgy, so we talk about the liturgy of the church, and maybe a traditional church is more liturgical and there's responses and things that you do. Liturgy means the work of the people. But what is the liturgy of your life? Everyone has liturgy. Everyone has the work of the people. Everything you do is a rhythm or a routine that says something about who you are, what you are made for, and who you worship. There are very strong forces drawing your worship away from the living God, the one true God. So we have this amazing example here of 3 very young men who make a stand and say, we are not going to be coerced, we are not going to be forced into our worship being directed anywhere else other than the one true God. And what they say is actually really profound, especially if you consider them to be teenagers. Firstly, they say, we do not need to defend ourselves. Imagine getting drawn before a king who has complete control over your life and can do anything to you, has already done anything he wants to you, and you've been brought here on charges of not fulfilling the king's wishes, and you stand there before the king and you go, we don't need to defend ourselves to you. Like, the boldness of that. Where does that come from? How does someone say something so bold? To have no fear whatsoever of the king. Like, no anxiety, almost no adrenaline, it seems, pumping through their veins. It's just, we don't even need to defend ourselves to you, O king. Where does that come from? It comes from someone who knows they actually report to someone higher, greater, more powerful. You can only do that when you know your true audience, the one you truly work for and live for, is higher and greater. We do not need to defend ourselves to you, O King, because you are lesser than who we really belong to. What they then go on to say is, our God is able. We do not need to defend ourselves to you. Our God is able. Our God is able to save us. Our God is able to bring us through whatever punishment you want to bring on us, whatever suffering is in store for us ahead. Our God has the ability. He's able to do more than we could possibly imagine, more than we could possibly ask of him. Our God is able. But then they go on to say this, and this is probably the greatest sign of maturity in what they say. So they go on from saying, we do not need to defend ourselves to you, O King. Our God is able. Our God is the greatest, the only one we need to care about. But then they say, but even if he doesn't bring us through this fire, we're still not going to bow down to you, King, and your idol, your statue that you've made. They still choose to worship God. They still choose not to bow down to any other coercive forces. They remain faithful to God, even if he doesn't save them from the fire. So their faith, and this is a challenge for many of us who've lived quite comfortable lives, this is a challenge for us. Their faith is not caught up entirely in God will provide all of my needs. God will make my life comfortable. God will prevent suffering from coming. Their faith is not dependent on, well, if I get sick, I must be healed from everything. They have a maturity in their faith that will hold them even through suffering. They will not let go of God. So why do we have these Old Testament stories? What benefit are they to us? In Hebrews chapter 11 and 12. In Hebrews 11, there's a long list of faithful people throughout the Old Testament. People who've lived by faith, about Abraham and Moses, and how there's Rahab in there, and then people like Gideon and Barak and Samson are named, David and Samuel. And then it says, and through faith they did all these things. People who shut the mouth of lions, quenched the fury of flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are named, or not named, but they're mentioned in Hebrews 11 as people of faith. But it goes on. If you look at the start of Hebrews 12, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, all these people throughout history who've lived a life of faith, since we have that, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Are you feeling weary and losing heart? If you feel weary, if you feel like you are losing heart, then stories like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are for you. They are examples of faith to read, to be inspired by, that these people who suffered great oppression were still able to live and not throw out their faith. So even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. How does one do that? How can Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do such a thing? Well, we actually have something more than what those three young men had. In a sense, God's presence was a little bit in the background. That fourth figure there, that King Nebuchadnezzar only kind of vaguely sees. There's some mystery about that. That God's presence there with them is a little bit in the background. But what we have now is a God who's brought himself into the foreground. God who's come to us, born to live as one of us. We know his name, Jesus Christ. There is another in the fire, one who came into the broken world that we live in, who knows the temptations that we face, who knows what it's like to experience pain, who knows what it's like to experience grief. His friend Lazarus died. He knows what we go through. And he came to be with us. How can we worship? How can we stay true? Because we have a God who loves us so much, he would come into our world to stand with us, to be with us till the end. I'm going to hand over to Erin, who has a pretty amazing story. If you were at the Oaktree weekend away, there was a few people who actually got to hear this story, but it is an amazing example of how God is present in our biggest moments. And Erin, are you happy to share a little bit of a story?
Yes, as Mark said, I shared this during our worship time while we were away on our Oaktree retreat. But it certainly connects with the story of today. So, another in the fire. A long time ago, when I was 19, this is many years ago, I spent part of my year over in Ethiopia serving with the UNHCR, working in a refugee camp on the border of Ethiopia and South Sudan. And I lived and worked within a tribe called the Uruks, the South Sudanese people. And it was a beautiful time. I have lots of stories I'd love to share with you. But 6 months after returning home, I came down with a very mysterious illness. And I was so critically ill that I was rushed off to hospital and put in an isolation room, and nobody could figure out what was happening. We had doctor after doctor after doctor after doctor, specialist after specialist coming in to try and figure out what was happening. And I was increasingly becoming more and more and more unwell. After about, I don't even know how many days, they just kept trying to give me different antibiotics. They figured out that there was an infection in my spinal fluid, so it was a type of meningitis. But if you know anything about meningitis, we're talking about the brain. It's like a significant kind of time factor. I'm seeing our nursing student nodding. Yep, Georgia's like, yep. So they're just like pumping me full of stuff, trying to just kill whatever is going on, but to no avail. And I still remember there was this one evening, and because I'm in this isolation room, so people are not like coming in and out, very, very alone in this space. And I was lying in bed during a night time, and my body was writhing in pain, like full body shuddering of pain. And I remember I couldn't even turn myself over, so I was lying on my side. And I just remember like these waves of shudders that would happen with my body, and the pain and the exhaustion was just immense. And I just remember thinking like, ugh, like what is to come of this? And it was in the dark of the night that I was lying there, and the shudders continued, and they were like violent shudders. Like I remember when they were doing a spinal, what's the thing when they put it in your spinal fluid? Like a lumbar puncture, thank you. I'm looking at my nursing people. They had to have 4 people hold me down. Like that's how violently my body was shuddering. So my body was shuddering throughout the night. And in the dark of the night, it would have been like in the early mornings, early hours of the morning, I was lying there. I couldn't sleep, but I felt every time my body shudder, I suddenly realized someone was lying behind me. So I was lying on the bed like this, and there was suddenly someone lying behind me, and I could feel the knees tucked up behind my knees. And every time I shuddered, the figure behind me would shudder as well. And in these early morning hours, I felt this presence, this body, physical body lying behind me, shuddering as I shuddered. And I instantly knew it was Jesus. I instantly knew it was Jesus. And it wasn't just a sense of somebody, like a spirit or a presence or anything like. It was a physical manifestation of the living God, of Jesus lying behind me. And as my body shuddered in pain, and exhaustion, his body shuddered alongside my own. And at that very same moment, I looked up and I could see that there was another figure, another person standing at the end of my bed. And this person was just standing. Like, I kind of can't describe it. It was just like a person who was just standing, and they just embodied peace. Like they were slightly luminescent, and they just stood there and they just embodied peace. And I knew the presence standing at my feet, and my body, as I continued to shudder and I continued to writhe in pain, but the peace that just floated over me was unbelievably immense. And it's funny, in that moment, I knew, as I said, I knew instantly that the Son of God had come and entered into my own suffering and wasn't standing far away and there, poor you, but actually entered into my physical suffering and suffered alongside me. So as I shuddered, Jesus shuddered too. And I ended up, falling asleep, and I woke up in the morning and I couldn't speak. Like, I couldn't speak, and my mum came in that morning, and I just kept saying to her, like, I don't know what's wrong, I can't speak. And I wrote to her and I said, I need you to go and get our pastor. So our pastor came in, and he was a very good friend of ours, and he came and he sat next to me, and I just was weeping in bed. And he sat there and he said, did the Lord come and visit you last night? And my mouth opened. I was like, yes. Yes, that's what it was. And Pastor Fraser said to me, now tell me, were there two? Yes, there were. There were two. There was the presence of Jesus lying next to me, entering into my suffering. Are you getting teary, babe? Entering into my suffering, and then the presence of God's peace embodied before me. And it was just the most incredible experience and the most real encounter of the truth of Jesus entering into our suffering and taking that on physically. I obviously recovered. I'm here. It was a couple of days later, they figured out that I had some very exotic strain of meningitis that they'd never seen before, and they had to concoct some deathly antibiotic type thing. And I'm here today. Thank you, Jesus. But what a powerful realization that we have a God who is willing to take on our suffering, not to stand from afar and there, but let me take it and I will suffer alongside you. So I can tell you from my own life, it's really true. There is another in the fire. I will pray for us, yes. And we'll invite the band up and we'll